Welcome back to the Atma Paradigm, and we continue part 4 of our series entitled The Universe and Beyond. Today's title is Consciousness in its Free State. Now, what do we mean by the free state of consciousness? And what's led to this suggestion that there might be such a free state? Well, I think this topic comes out of the conclusions from our recent sessions. After all, we used the exploration of the virtual reality analogy to think about the nature of consciousness, particularly when it's absorbed in the illusions of life within what we call the participative reality of this universe. And we considered how we are enamored of the body we have adopted as our current avatar. And how we identify so wholeheartedly with its characteristics. And we define ourselves exactly according to the bodily type. Now, that we do that even to the point of accepting the idea that we're aging as our body changes, and that one day we might face demise and death when our avatar body ceases to function. So we saw within this virtual reality analogy this sort of anxiety and fear, and we saw that anxiety and fear could be considered a sort of bewilderment, even lunacy, because it's inconsistent with a kind of the rational understanding that I am just playing in this virtual reality game. So in the same way, are we in that state of bewilderment, believing that our actual existence is this body within this physical world? So analysing all of that kind of led to the suggestion that maybe there might be a free state of consciousness. Now my slideshow has just done something a little odd. Let me just reset that. Yeah. So this led to our question: what is consciousness in its free state? Now, there's a challenge for the deductive and the inductive methods to explore the nature of something in its free state, because generally, like in science, we identify and assign properties to something based on how it interacts with other things. For instance, atoms are things defined by their chemical properties, how they bond with similar atoms, and also how they bond with other atoms. So how do we study the free state of something, or rather the free state of something else? It's difficult. But the difference that we have with consciousness is that it is not something else. Consciousness is who and what we are. We're an entity composed and possessing this nature of consciousness. Therefore, the study of the free state of consciousness is really a study of ourselves. So it's not only possible, but you could suggest that it's probably the only thing that we can study the free state of. But still, there are challenges, because particularly of the way that consciousness, with the consciousness that we're most familiar with, i.e. our own, is, it seems, completely inextricably intertwined with non-conscious cognitive stuff, such as the concepts of our selfhood, our personality filters and our biases, and all the stuff within our minds. So consciousness seems to be wrapped up with all of those things. So if we're going to study consciousness in its free state, all we have to do is untangle ourselves from that lot, and then we figure out what's left in this state of free consciousness. And then we have to determine what of that is left might be the same or different than it is when consciousness is interacting with the physical body and with various mental functions. So that's the challenge. Easy? Well, not that easy. Let's take it step by step. First, we'll remind ourselves of some various key points that we've established about the nature of consciousness from previous sessions. So in our summary study of how life behaves, what drives and motivates it, we found 3 key factors: existence, knowledge and pleasure. We saw that there's survival instinct in all life forms. And this seems to relate to the presence of a non-temporal conscious entity. That even in the embodied state, that nature of being free from time, of not having anything that will end our existence, seems to feed through in the life form, even in the embodied state. Every life form recoils from the notion of its demise. And we seek knowledge to further our ability to survive, but more importantly, in order to further our desire for finding pleasure, comfort, security, and ease of mind. So we've suggested that these three motivating drivers are evident when consciousness is embodied because they are inherent in the nature of consciousness. And the Vedic texts consider these three as integral to the constitution of the Atma and refer to them in these three words: Sat, Chit and Ananda. Sat, as it relates to the Atma's nature, is non-temporal, outside of and unaffected by time. Chit, as it relates to the Atma's nature, as sentient, aware, conscious, knowledgeable. And Ananda, as it relates to the Atma's nature to be pleasureful and to express love. So these factors are pertinent to today's analysis because they're said to represent the underlying inherent nature of the Atma. So when the Atma is present within a biological body, these interests manifest perhaps only to a partial or small extent. So what is it that drives the Atma to take on a physical body? Does that drive for expression through a set of senses and faculties also arise from some inherent aspect of consciousness? What is it that drives the Atma to take on then a body? Here's our question. Is that all there is for consciousness? Is it that does consciousness only exist in a relationship with the world of matter, Prakriti? Does it only get to be fully aware when it experiences existence within a body? Or is it like our VR, our virtual reality gamers? Is there something more for them? Something outside of the cosmic game that we could be participating in? So, if being in a body within material reality were all that there actually is, then why do we feel such dissatisfaction? Bearing in mind how we looked at things in the VR analogy, it seems that the outcomes and results for consciousness in the embodied world seem to be a limitation of our powers, a diminishment of who we are. So embodied consciousness, whilst like the VR games offers some thrills, some enjoyment, seems to have built-in limitations and built-in ultimate frustrations. And this dichotomy between our intuitive sense of our conscious nature and our aspirations for eternality and pleasure, when you compare that with the actuality of our experiences in this world, hint at the possibility that what we could be, that what we're experiencing is far short of the kind of unadulterated, free form of consciousness that might be a potential for us. But how are we to know? How are we to know that there could be more? Well, it's a subject of many Vedic texts. And I think it's going to be very difficult for us to really enter this topic without taking guidance and insights from sources which contain revelations and insights, particularly from deep practices of consciousness exploration through yoga, meditation, and so on. But I'm not asking you to accept any of the statements we make today as a matter of faith. We're going to consider the logic and rationale for all the various ideas and how they fit with our intuitions and our realizations and also with our aspirations. And I think it's within this topic that Vedanta comes into its own. Let me explain where Vedanta comes from. The Upanishads are seminal philosophical texts found throughout the various Vedas. And together, they provide the basis of all Vedanta concepts. And Vedanta Sutra, or the Brahma Sutra, is a summary of all these essential ideas presented within the Upanishads. And when we say sutra, sutra is our short texts which are intended to form a chain of ideas and concepts. So Vedanta organizes the themes of the Upanishad. It clarifies the use of the terms that are used there and addresses many doubts and counter-arguments that are sometimes used in debating over the meaning of those of the Upanishads. So in doing all of this, Vedanta develops and presents the overall coherent thesis of the Upanishads. And then there are the Puranas. And the Puranas are considered particularly important because they support and explain the deep and often complex themes that are found in Vedanta. And of all the Puranas, the Bhagavat Purana or Srimad Bhagavatam is considered to be the most important for this purpose because it is the principal direct commentary and exposition of Vedanta, written and compiled by the author of Vedanta, Vyas. So both Vedanta and the Bhagavatam begin with the same meditation relevant to today. Janmadhyasya yataha. That which exists beyond the origins of the universe. And Vedanta uses this phrase to define the concept of Brahman. Brahman is a state of existence beyond even the manifest universe that appears, exists for a while, and then dissolves. Brahman is beyond even the unmanifest matter that provides the raw materials for this and all the universes. It's beyond even the state of aggregated intention of the Atmas belonging to this universe. So it used to puzzle me. Brahman, the most important topic in all of Vedanta. And it's defined in terms of creation, maintenance and dissolution of the universe. The universe is made of matter. That seemed to be a bit of a negative definition, kind of defining something really important, Brahman, by what it is not. But because we are wrapped up in our current embodied life within this universe, this definition of Brahman gives us a starting point, something to meditate, and is highly pertinent to our question today because Brahman in Vedanta terms is this state or realm of consciousness in its free state. So we're going to start with a list of the various features we have noted about consciousness through our sessions. And these are of course features of consciousness that we relate to within our current understanding embodied within this world. And I'm going to be referring to our current state of embodiment and experience of the phenomenal world as, in simple terms, a conditioned state, meaning we are dependent on our senses and our mind for all our experiences. Now, first, we'd like to kind of suggest that we recognize I'm conscious. I exist because I'm conscious, and I'm conscious because I exist. Consciousness cannot be reduced to physical properties nor to neural activity. Consciousness is a fundamental component of reality. It is non-physical, non-biological, non-neural in nature. This was something we explored in part 1. We also explored that consciousness is non-temporal. When consciousness observes the passing of time, consciousness as the unified subject undergoing those experiences is not changed. Aspects of our awareness are changed, but consciousness as the unified subject undergoing the experiences is not changed over time. We remain the same entity who was witness to the experience of our childhood as we are today. And in fact, as we've said, it is the non-temporal nature of consciousness as the observer that allows us to observe the effect of temporal change on the objects of our conscious perception. And then we noted that each one of us senses ourselves to be a singular, unified entity, an individual quantum of consciousness, an Atma. And we'll consider arguments as to whether that is the permanent or original state of consciousness. But for now, whatever one's belief about ultimate reality, each one of us experiences, I experience myself to be an individual. That's our common experience. And we are cognizant. We experience thoughts, and we experience them while awake, and even when dreaming, we experience a kind of swirl of thoughts and dreams going through our minds. Now, as we've said, These thoughts may be random, daft, wrong, illusory, but they are a real experience of our cognition. As Descartes said, we are thinking things. And much of our cognition is related to the expression of our will. Will as our desire to vary the content and quality of our experiences. Now we've tried to establish that consciousness is a source of will, and a source of will that determines the manifestation of matter. And it's our proposition that only a sentient conscious entity can be a source of will, and that only the expression of will provides novel or new specifying information within physical systems. Now, although will emanates from the actual nature and expression of the Atma, it is the mind that adulterates it with biases, with preferences, with judgments, with desires and all the other things. So most of our desires and actions are influenced and conditioned by everything we see, we hear, we witness, we're fed, and as well as our own biases and filters arising both from our nature and also our nurture. But it is the fact of our being a source of will that entices us to accept and act even on conditioned desires. So we act on these conditioned desires because we see them as the potential fulfillment of our will and our actual agenda in life. Now, our own individual intention contains the information that's used to manifest the activities of our brain, senses and bodies. But the group or aggregate intentions of many Atmas provides the specifying information for the manifestation of matter on a much grander scale. And that has been the subject of a lot of part 4. Desires and will, of course, are related to what we experience. And what we experience in this world is related to qualia. Remember qualia? The qualities of our mental content. And these are examples, or these are the qualities of sensory perception. You know, the visuals with form, colours and movement, or the types of colours, flavours, fragrance and touch sensations that we enjoy. But they're also the qualities of our emotions, our feelings and our inner sensations. So the experience of qualia involves the interaction of ourselves with the world around via its representation to us on the theatre of awareness by the mind. So we are, as Atmas, the audience of the theatre of awareness. We are the observer with the ability to have such perception of qualia, an ability that we have identified as an irreducible feature of consciousness. So why we say perception of qualia is a feature of the Atma. And currently our conscious self, of course, is associated with and it's within a biological body. Now, we showed that this relationship with the biological body enables the Atma to fulfill 2 key desires, for experience and for agency, because the body facilitates those drives through the senses and faculties. And we've suggested that there is logic, and we also presented some evidence to support the idea that consciousness can persist even whilst not being embodied. So what might that mean for consciousness in its free state? And this ties in with the fact that within this body we are the enjoyer of the activities that the body can do, and also that we are dependent on our sense of self and identity based on our body. So, and on the basis of that, we form relationships and enjoy the emotions of community, of family, of kinship, of friendship, of love. So it seems that so much of what we experience is closely related to factors that are really grounded in the materiality of this world. Our body, our mind, our physical enjoyments, our activities, our relationships with others. So what is left for consciousness when it has no access to those things? One might argue that the physical universe seems to have so much more to offer. It contains all sorts of objects and things that aren't just consciousness. It has more to offer consciousness than consciousness being on its own, if you like. Now that's, I think, quite a common assumption. But we're going to see that that's based on rather naive and faulty assumptions about matter and about consciousness. Because the universe isn't some kind of playground. It's not a playground that some bored conscious entities in their free state suddenly discover, here's finally something we can go and enjoy. Like bored kids, discovering that there's something exciting happening. No, it's not like that. Because we've discussed in recent sessions how the manifested universe is a product derived from the intentions of consciousness. So whatever the universe contains that can be experienced relies on the pre-existing ability of consciousness to perceive and interact with it. Whatever the universe contains, we help put it there. So I think there are several key philosophical questions to bear in mind as we approach this topic. Do we think that consciousness in its free state should be able to enjoy greater scope and quality of experience than it can while in the conditioned state? Or would it provide a lesser state or scope of experience? Well, another way of asking this is to consider if our experiences of qualia and sensory activities within this world are a welcome addition to what consciousness in its free state might otherwise not be able to enjoy or have to live without. Or you could ask it, is consciousness solely designed and intended to experience material reality? Is the free state of consciousness more or less than the embodied state? That's really what it boils down to. And I think there are several points which suggest why it might be the former. Consciousness, being non-temporal, means that the sense of being in a temporal situation and the fear of our demise is an illusory and diminished frame of cognition. Secondly, the aspiration of consciousness for pleasure and fulfillment, which we identified as axiomatic, seems to be frustrated and problematic for an embodied entity. And thirdly, our agency in this world is limited by being mediated by our minds, the gunas, prakriti, karma, and all the various circumstances that are beyond our control. So I think there's a level of limitation, diminishment, and frustration that indicates that what consciousness is experiencing within the material conditioned sphere is a much lesser state than consciousness really would like to enjoy, which it really feels it deserves to enjoy. So I think it's now time to consider how the 9 points we identified just earlier, the characteristics of consciousness in its conditioned state within the universe, we're now going to consider how they might relate to the characteristics, the same characteristics, and if they are present within consciousness when it's in its free state. Now, the first one, conscious existence. Well, throughout this whole series we've proceeded on the basis that we exist as conscious beings. We've always said we exist, we are conscious. But is that also true of the free state? It might seem very straightforward to say that, yeah, of course, consciousness in its free state would also enjoy conscious existence. But let's not take anything for granted. After all, we undergo periods of apparent non-consciousness during sleep or anesthesia, fainting or blackout. But we did discuss the idea that even in those situations, the potential and ability of consciousness persists. It is just that there is no content of experience being fed by the mind that we can recall thereafter. And we'd also suggest that those impediments to our state of awareness, such as fainting, deep sleep and so on, are connected to particular embodied circumstances. And currently, our state of consciousness it's like having really hopeless, lousy internet and Wi-Fi connections. We keep coming in and out of awareness. Whereas perhaps consciousness in its free state is with a super fast connection, where we're more likely to enjoy expanded, permanent, more reliable states of consciousness. So I'm going to tick that one, meaning that beyond the universe, in the free state, consciousness existence is experienced by consciousness. So what of the feature of being non-temporal? Well, you think that was also straightforward. Time is that which facilitates the change of information within physical objects. It has a sphere of influence, which is limited to those things that can be changed because of the specification of their guna data content. And Brahman has been defined by Vedanta as that which is beyond the purview of the changing material scene. So it should be a form of existence beyond the influence of time. And consciousness, even in its conditioned state, is immune to the effects of time. So, every reason to suppose that consciousness in its free state is non-temporal. And in this context, non-temporal, of course, equates with eternal, as meaning beyond the scope of time. It's not just a permanently existing for a long time within time. No, it's in a state that is not changed or affected by time. And we'll be returning to discuss non-temporal eternity in a bit. But before that, what about our sense of individuality? Now, this is an essential intuition about our present state of consciousness. As we said, I sense myself to be an individual. I am the subject of my experience. I know what I mean to be I. I don't understand what everyone else is thinking and feeling. I don't know that. I can only try and judge it by what I feel, but I am not feeling what you are feeling. So this sense of individuality is an essential intuition about our present state of consciousness. But does this state of being an individual persist in the free state of Brahman? Now, many people suppose that the individuality of consciousness is solely linked to being separately embodied as we are at the moment. But once we're freed from embodiment in a free or liberated state, our consciousness will merge back into one single consciousness. This is a popular idea amongst many modern yoga adherents and non-dualist philosophers. And there's also some historical commentaries on Vedanta Sutra and the Upanishads which promote this idea under the title of Advaitavad, or non-dual monist Vedanta. And perhaps there are even obvious attractions of this for many people. After all, our preoccupation as seeming individuals struggling against others is a cause for so much conflict and unhappiness in this world. So wouldn't it be great if we get to transcend all of this separatist mentality and realize that we actually are all one? Now, way back in session 2.2, I cited various forms of monism, including Advaita. And my essential point then was to point out that none of those versions of monist philosophy actually achieved 100% monism. And my point is that anything less than exactly 100% monism isn't actually oneness. Rather, it will then rely on a variety of the philosophy of Bheda, the idea of simultaneous oneness and difference, the acknowledgement of that the ontological status of all reality has commonality and unity of certain properties, while simultaneously and without detriment to those common factors has features of distinctiveness and difference. And it is, in my opinion, the failure of Advaita or other forms of monism to remain consistent to its claims of 100% oneness or monism that reveals the weakness and fallacy of its ideology. And this weakness is evident in the kind of archetype examples used by monism to convey their message. For instance, the example of the merging of individual consciousness into the totality of consciousness using the example of a pot. This is the example called Paricheda Vada. And it goes like this. They say, currently our consciousness is like the air within an enclosed pot. The pot represents our body and mind. When the pot is broken by the practice of self-realization and knowledge, our trapped consciousness, the trapped air, is freed and merges into the air outside and beyond. So it sounds like a nice, simple example of how there is no distinction between the air in the pot and the air outside of the pot. Except that's kind of exactly the distinction. the air inside the pot and outside are of the same quality, they're air stuff, that's its commonality, but the distinction is that some of it has been separated and is experiencing itself differently to the rest. So we have to ask why that is and how did it happen? How does the oneness of the sky or air become separated out? Why does the oneness of all consciousness start to experience individuality? And in this example, what is the status of the pot? Is it a real thing or not? If it's real, then is the pot something different to consciousness, i.e. that which can enclose consciousness, can separate it from the totality? If that is something real, then that means there must be something separate from consciousness. There's something which can enclose consciousness, can cleave it off from the whole. And according to Advaita monism, consciousness is all that exists. So the pot example breaks monism. But if you say that the pot isn't actually real, then how is consciousness befooled by something that doesn't exist? But if the claim is that ignorance is the cause of the illusion, you have the same issue. Because if ignorance is real to have that effect, again, monism is broken. How can ignorance exist within the totality of pure consciousness? And you could ask, where does this ignorance come from that manages to have this effect? It can't have its origin within perfect consciousness, and it cannot have its origin in the individualized conscious entities, because under the Advaita idea, those individuals cannot exist until they are affected by ignorance. So the example breaks down within its monist credentials. Another key example used is Pratibimbavad. Bimba refers to the sun, and Pratibimba is to do with the reflection. So this is the idea that universal consciousness, represented in this analogy by the sun, is reflected in various pots of water. So you can see that same sun, but in little, in each of the pots. The water in the pots may shimmer, but the sun in the sky is unaffected. But if this is the case, then each of us, as individual conscious entities, or feeling ourselves to be individual consciousness entities, must just be a reflection on the water of the pot. But what could exist independently of universal consciousness that would reflect it? Meaning, where do you get the pot and the water from? What's that system if it is not part of the sun and the universal consciousness? So, same thing. And is the reflection real or not? If the reflection is real, then there is a real distinction between us and the sun. And if it's not, then on what basis is the one universal consciousness having individualized experiences? So this kind of shows the key problem for the variations of monist ideas of universal consciousness. How can that which is utterly, absolutely unified and undifferentiated become individualized? Even if that individualization is claimed to be only apparent or illusory or temporary or the basis of ignorance, it still doesn't matter. You still have the problem that universal consciousness should never get to the point of thinking it is individualized. So we're doing all this because we're trying to understand, if I feel myself as an individual now, what is my situation in the free state? And I suggest that a simpler, more consistent conclusion is that our sense of individuality is inherent. It's a permanent feature of the Atma. And there are many statements within Vedanta that establish the oneness of consciousness between the Atma and Brahman. But oneness in terms of quality and shared features of consciousness and shared sense of being an individual entity. But it also recognizes the permanent intrinsic distinctiveness between us. That each one of us is a quantized individual Atma particle of consciousness. And so we have a relationship of quality with all the rest of Brahman, but we retain our individual sense of an Atma entity. So I suggest we accept the individuality of consciousness in its free state as a feature beyond the universe. Our next question considers the ability of individual consciousness to be cognizant. And by this I mean that the Atma in its free state has the ability to think. Now this raises the questions. What does it think about? How does it do that without a mind composed of the cognitive elements connected to a body and the senses? So the subject matter for its thinking will become clearer as we look at some of the other features down our list. For now, let's remind ourselves that the ability to think within the embodied situation arises from the capacity of the Atma to experience the content of the mind. The Atma has identified itself in the first instance with our sense of persona, the thing we call the ahankara, the actor on the stage of awareness. How is it possible to undergo identification with something outside of ourselves without ourselves having the capacity for thought? Because identification is a form of cognition, of thinking. It requires us to consider the personage and the circumstances of the character we're relating to. Check it out next time you feel yourself empathizing with a character in a film or a book. You've allowed yourself to mull over aspects that you find interesting or intriguing or compelling or attractive about the situation. Now, the problem is that as an embodied Atma, we tend not to be able to recognize our own thinking as an Atma because we're so totally given over to hearing and accepting the thoughts fed to us by the mind. So currently all our thoughts really are mentally fed to us, and we don't understand how to think as an Atma. But, and I think this is a general principle at work through this list, we would not be interested or attracted by the stuff that the mind offers us in terms of thoughts, were they not of a similar nature to the Atma's own inherent way of thinking and cognition. Now, those who have practiced meditation, and I mean serious meditation, may have experienced that when one stills what the Yoga Sutras call the turnings of the mind, there is the chance to experience thought and realization at a deeper level. So I'm going to tick that one off as well. Now, we've established that another form of cognition that is inherent within the Atma is related to our sense of agency, that the Atma is a source of will, and at least we know it's a source of will when embodied. Now, it's also true of the Atma when we talked about that non-embodied state pre-existing the universe when it generates aggregated intention. So we've concluded that the Atma is a source of agency prior to and within the universe. Now, why would this be so only in reference to the universe? Where did the Atma gain that power of agency if it were not an inherent and permanent feature of consciousness? It could not be from any aspect such as the mind that existed within the universe. So our sense of agency is not something that's given to us, it is something inherent. But is it only expressed when the Atma is in relationship to the universe? Well, I think it's more logical to understand that in its free state, consciousness is a source of will. But I haven't ticked it. Wait a minute. Agency expressed by the conditioned Atma has been defined as the ability to vary the guna data within the manifestation of physical things. But that can't apply to the free state. And we've also said that for the conditioned Atma, will is the wish to vary the content of its experiences. But what experiences does the Atma have in the free state? And how can things change there? So before we endorse this point, and perhaps the next point as well, we're going to have a bit more, learn a bit more what's going on within consciousness and Brahman. But so for now, I'm just putting this kind of exclamation mark on source of will, and we'll clarify it as we go further. The next one is perception of variegated forms and qualities, the point I've just raised. How does this work? How does the Atma in its pure state, in its free state, enjoy the perception of forms? And now this was an important analysis in part 1, that neither qualia nor the observer of qualia could be reduced to physical properties or neural activity. So the ability for consciousness to perceive forms whilst involved with a mind and body is understood, and it's understood to be something that is an inherent ability of the Atma. But does consciousness in its free state retain that ability? Now, under our principle that the free state should not be a dimmer version of the conditioned, we would conclude that no fundamental ability associated with the conditioned state should be impossible for consciousness in its free state. But the big question to be addressed is there anything like form or observable properties that are available to be perceived in the free state? So before we tick this box, we're going to have to deal with the next related point. Does the free state possess qualities of form? Now, this is the point in which most people's inner monist pipes up. They say, we're talking about the realm of free consciousness. How is there any possibility of such things as forms and qualities and so on? Surely these sort of qualities relate only to things in the temporary world of Prakriti matter. They can't exist in the realm of consciousness in Brahman. And some people may also be steeped in the kind of spirit-matter dichotomy and think that, well, matter is the world of forms, or consciousness, or spirit in their terms, would be the opposite, a place of no forms. After all, forms distinguish and divide things. The form of one object makes it different to another. Well, it's natural to believe that duality is the cause of all conflict and misery in the material sphere, and to think we want none of that type of thing and nothing that leads to that in the realm of pure consciousness. So I understand that that's a kind of reasonable bit of reasoning, but it's actually upside down. Are forms a feature of matter or of consciousness? Of course, we see objects with shapes all around us in this world, and they seem to be real hard things compared to amorphous and intangible things we call mind and consciousness, spirit, whatever. But our whole analysis of modern physics and Sankhya metaphysics has concluded that matter is simply the combination of energy and information. Energy and information that's manifesting what we observe and experience as physical properties. So the philosophical question is this: is form a permanent, inherent feature of matter, or is it a principle imposed upon matter by consciousness? For instance, back to our clay pot. It's got form at this moment as a pot. Previously it was formless clay, but the action and input of the potter imbued that formless stuff with this beautiful shape of the pot. Will that form persist? For a bit. And then like castle made of sand, it's going to disappear back to its formlessness, thanks to the unforgiving potency of entropy. The conclusion is matter would have no form whatsoever were it not for the input of consciousness. Consider this. What's the shape? Quickly, what's the shape? It's a triangle, right? Okay, it's not a very exact or perfect one. The lines aren't nice and straight, but we accept it as a rough and reasonable representation of a triangle. But a triangle is a form that has very specific defined characteristics. It is a set of 3 points joined up by 3 straight lines, right? In Plato's term, this is the kind of origin, or the what he called the ideal form of a triangle. And he was using ideal not just in the nicest, meaning to mean the nicest, ideal in that it is the original kind of archetype. So our squiggly version, now I've put it on it's superimposed, doesn't quite match the ideal. But that doesn't matter. When we see it on its own, we're happy to accept it as a triangle, because we already hold the concept of a triangle within our minds. And the rough one reminds us of that ideal and allows us to accept it as a reflection or representation of the original ideal form. So Plato's point is that there has to exist an ideal of something before we can recognize that something as being a version of the ideal. So the version doesn't have to be as perfect or to have all the attributes of the original ideal. It just has to have sufficient of the ideal's attributes to be accepted as a manifestation of that form. Now, the Bhagavad Gita makes a similar point when it asks us to contemplate a tree. But a tree that has its trunk and branches going downwards instead of up, and its roots growing upwards. Where do we see such a tree? In the reflection of a lake of water. And this, is, the Gita suggests, is our experience of phenomenal reality. We see the form of the tree. We see its colours, the lovely reds and russet oranges of autumn. We see the movement of the leaves and branches in the wind. But the qualities of the shape and colours do not actually exist in the water. There's no outline of the tree in the water. The water is not in the shape of the tree. The water is not in the colour of the tree. There's no orange stuff there. Where do the shapes and the colours come from? Why are we able to see and recognise these forms and colours in the water? Well, it's because they exist in the shape and colours of the real tree standing on the bank by the lake. We get to experience the qualities of that real tree within the water as a reflection of the reality in which those qualities actually exist. So the forms can be said to be present within the surface reflection, but they're not complete, they're not clear, they're not as vivid as the original. They become less clear if the ripples start to become more intense. Can we say that the forms in the reflection belong to the water? Are they properties of the water? No. The property of the water is this. It is able to reflect the properties of the reality. The property of matter doesn't have forms and things of its own. It simply has the ability to reflect and represent those forms, colours and qualities to us. So, the Gita claims that this is the principle that is true of all the observable properties that we perceive in nature. Matter is like clay, it has the potential to manifest, but it relies on the input of information for that to happen. So the form that turns clay into a vase relies on the imagination of the potter. Form, when seen in matter, is a quality contributed by consciousness. It is imposed upon matter for the benefit of consciousness. And like the shimmering reflection on the water surface, the forms that matter adopts are short-lived. They are eroded and destroyed very quickly with time, like the strawberries and bananas we saw last week. And that should persuade us that form is a transient imposition on matter's preference. Matter's preference is actually to be what it really is, disordered, amorphous, formless. So in summary, there's no way to justify the simplistic notion that form is an inherent property of matter. Rather, form is a characteristic which is dependent on consciousness, is imported into the physical sphere thanks to consciousness' interaction with matter. Hence, I conclude that consciousness not only observes forms in the conditioned state, it helps to import those characteristics into the world of matter. And that consciousness in the free state retains that ability to observe forms, because forms and qualities exist there as the ideals, the originals within the free consciousness realm. And in fact, probably the best explanation for why consciousness observes form in the conditioned state and why there is the appearance of forms here at all is because variegated forms exist as part of the experience of consciousness in its free state. And a semblance of those forms has to be available in the conditioned state so that consciousness can be in any way attracted, entertained, and get emotionally involved with them. So now I'm giving full ticks to these points: source of will, perception of forms, and form on our chart. But there's a question. If all the forms and qualities that we experience as qualia in this world are imitations, copies, and representations of the original ideal forms and features that exist as observable to consciousness in its free state, then the question comes, what about consciousness itself? Does it possess a form? Now, to address this, we really have to get over the kind of assumptions we may have about individuality and forms being the cause of division and suffering. Let's ask ourselves why consciousness should wish to take on its biological avatar form in the conditioned state. In our virtual reality analogy, we explained how we are attracted to enter the game and to take on an avatar because we are used to the idea of having a body and to achieving things through the faculties of that form. Is this the same for the Atmas as they enter the kind of cosmic game? Do they eagerly take on and identify with their biological bodies because they are used to the idea of having a bodily form and using that form to express their intentions? Now, we've discussed the idea that the mind, an aspect of Prakriti matter, takes on the form of its content. If the Atma conceives of itself, within the conditioned state as a human being, then the mind takes on that subtle form which helps to manifest and it becomes this subtle template that manifests that body in a physical way. So both the physical biological body and the subtle template of the mental body are coverings or sheaths which are extraneous to consciousness. But in the same way that the biological body forms to manifest the quality of the subtle template, perhaps that's because the nature of consciousness has its own form, and when it associates itself with the subtle realm, it imposes some form of form. It wants to have some kind of similar form. So the reflection of the nature of consciousness is to associate. This is a result of the reflection of the nature of consciousness wanting to associate itself with having, or rather being, a form. Because this is our reasoning behind the idea that consciousness, even in its free state, may possess or be a bodily shape. But the distinction here in the free state is that the form of consciousness is its inherent form. The Sanskrit term would be swarup. The form that consciousness has in the free state is not something we adopt or put on over us. It is the form composed of our own consciousness. It is us. So just as the mind takes on its form of contemplation, similarly, consciousness manifests as the form most suited to its contemplation and intentions, and particularly in terms of its interactions. And we're going to come to a bit more of that later and also deal with it in detail next week. So what is being suggested in the Bhagavad Purana is that all the forms of bodies that are on offer within the conditioned universe are imitations or representations of the idealized forms of consciousness that are enjoyed in its free state. And actually that helps to address one question I left unanswered about the various species. When we presented the idea that the intentions of consciousness generated the various subtle templates that help to manifest physical life forms, we left open the question, where do all these templates come from? Yeah, okay, the Atmas have many desires and aspirations that match the faculties of those templates and can be accommodated within those life forms. But where are the original concept designs or prototypes, or in Plato's terms, the ideals, from which these templates are drawn and devised? Well, the proposition here is that they are forms which they have their idealized forms which already exist within the realm of free consciousness. And some of those many forms that consciousness enjoy in that state and are manifested in their kind of perfected beauty and non-temporality and in full awareness can be present and available as choices for our avatars when we're in the material or physical sphere. Again, we're going to do more on that next week. Now, the great thing about biological bodies is they move and they do things. They get to enjoy activities. But surely activity requires there to be the passing of time. And we've defined time as that which affects only the information content of Prakriti matter. So time as we know it is not present in the free state of Brahman. That's all true. But like the other features of the free state of consciousness that are replicated and manifest as diminished representations in the conditioned universe, time is also a sort of perverted reflection of a system facilitating movement and activity within Brahman. And the system within Brahman works without any of the troublesome aspects that we associate with the passing of time, such as our enjoyment times coming to an end, things deteriorating, things dying, or just being plain bored. So we define the Atma as non-temporal, meaning it's not affected by time. That equates to eternal, no change whatsoever. If eternal doesn't mean no change, then if something can change, how is it eternal? That's how it's kind of calculated. But that is a miscalculation. Why should non-temporal existence not include the ability for change? And I want to remind what's behind the passing of time as we experience it here. We go back to our analogy of the TV system. It receives a new package of data at every moment, and this updates the image that we see, and we perceive that as the passing of time. But what time is facilitating is that ability to change and update the information. So in the world of matter, these updates of information that produce a new packet of data for us to see from one moment to the next, where do they come from? They arise from intention. And intention is generated by consciousness. So the change in the world of matter is actually generated by the continual, ongoing, permanent flow of intention arising from consciousness. Time does not change the world of matter. Time facilitates the change of information content within matter. But what influences the change of information content is intention. So the thing that actually changes matter is not time or guna data. It is intention arising from consciousness. And in the free state, consciousness has the opportunity to continue that intentionality, to actually unleash its intentionality, its will, its agency, without the requirements to have that intention converted into guna data or mediated with the forms and properties of matter by time. In the free state, consciousness's intention can do what it likes, basically. So for the Atmas in the free state, their intention directly produces change and activity. I'll give a little more on that next week, but I'm giving a big tick for it right now. The Atmas are the enjoyers of activities in the free state, and they're able to do that because intentionality can make change, can create activities, and time does not have to be involved. But you may be thinking, okay, all right, well, now we've got forms and we've got activities in this free state. What do they all get up to? Well, the sort of absolute freedom of expression of agency and intention sounds like a complete recipe for utter chaos. It's like the old joke of the Archangel Michael telling God, as he looks down on the planet and sees all the mess, he says, I was against free will in the first place. But so we have this idea that free will causes kind of utter chaos. And many of us, when we first kind of became aware of yoga and meditation, got the idea that the perfection for consciousness through these methods is to exist in some kind of never-ending state of bliss. No changing scene or situation, nothing happening to us, just the highest pleasure of permanent, unadulterated bliss, feeling ourselves to be one with all consciousness. And yes, say the Yoga and Vedanta texts, you can have that. But there's also more, if you want. Because if you really are at one with all other consciousness, that, says Vedanta and the Puranas, is when the fun can really begin. And this brings us to our final point on this list, love and relationships. Now, it's obvious that as humans we value these emotions above all others. Take a poll on what people believe is the most important factor of life, and they'll say it's love, it's relationships, it's family. And even amongst the creatures, the animals, bonding, connections and affections also seems to be desirable. And so we pointed out previously that these are aspirations which are a natural expression of the Atma. And just like everything else that the Atmas value in the conditioned state of this universe, love and relationships have their origin in the loving network of relationships and interactions that consciousness enjoys in the free state. Now, as I said, this might seem inconceivable to those whose imagery and conceptions of Brahman as this realm of bliss and consciousness entails just this never-ending kind of state of non-changing kind of blissed out meditation, and they want to get rid of everything that divides and separates it from one another, our individuality, our bodies, our selfishness. Sure. Certainly our interactions within this world leave a lot to be desired. And perhaps that's why we're here. Perhaps we're here to learn and to try and get it right. Perhaps we're here to be socialized, to come to an understanding of how to use our intention in the most productive and beneficial and enjoyable way. Perhaps those of us in this conditioned realm are the ones that can't be trusted with the potency of our intentions, because these intentions can really manifest anything we like. Maybe we're like the parasitoid wasp. Remember that example last week? Better we're embodied in a tiny biological body that limits the damage that all our selfish intentions might wreak on others. So here a little takeaway, that because Atmas in the conditioned state value love above all else, we can infer that love may be the fundamental intrinsic nature of the Atma, not just in the conditioned state. And although our conditioned nature, and in our conditioned nature we cannot presently conceive of love in its perfection, we shouldn't allow our conditioned self-centered nature to prejudice a vision for what is possible for consciousness in its free state. Now, I know that some people think, well, the highest perfection of love will be the union of myself with someone else. I think that's a cop-out. I just don't see that as being a higher state than me being willing to give of myself to someone else, to another consciousness who is not myself directly. But we would have that oneness of sharing and giving and serving and loving and devoting that is beyond, the selfishness of merging. So I'm going to take love and relationships and complete this chart. That in the free state, all of these things that we experience within the material sphere actually reach their perfection, they are ideal perfected attributes of the Atmas in the free state. And altogether, these attributes in the free state are a manifestation of the essential nature as Sat, being, the nature of consciousness pertaining to our eternal, non-temporal, individual existence. To Chit, knowing, which is the nature of consciousness pertaining to knowledge, perception and awareness. Ananda, loving, the pleasure aspect, the nature of consciousness relating to pleasure and bliss, but reaching its pinnacle in selfless devotional love. And Vigraha, I put doing, the desired form of consciousness that facilitates our doing things, particularly activities and particularly interactions that are loving exchanges with other conscious beings. So what is being suggested here is that the Atma in its free state might get to experience the pinnacle of these, being, of knowing, of loving and doing. And I think that these indications are that the free state of consciousness offers far more potential and excitement and is far more vibrant than any of us may imagine it to be. Now, we've introduced several aspects of reality today within these presentations, and it will be time to draw them together. What unifies all aspects of reality? What is the factor that is the origin of everything? Is that it's the origin of everything, it's all of the parts, and it's also the totality of everything. And this will be the subject matter for our final session of this webinar series next week, which will be our presentation on the nature of the absolute truth. The absolute truth, which we're defining as that from which everything else emanates. The big picture that holds everything together. And we'll be live same time, 6 p.m. in UK time on Thursday the 24th of December. And please, any questions, send in your questions, send in comments to info@s-pi.org. Thank you very much.